Jake Carter was 38 years old, and every single morning before the sun came up over the rooftops of his quiet, unremarkable neighborhood, he tied the same worn black apron around his waist and told himself the same quiet thing. Today would be a good day, because it had to be. He was a single father raising his 9-year-old daughter, Emily, in a small rented apartment 2 bus stops away from the diner where he had worked for the past 6 years. A narrow 2-bedroom unit, with a leaking kitchen faucet he never quite found time to fix, and a window that overlooked a parking lot instead of a view, though Emily always insisted the sunset still looked pretty from up there, if you squinted the right way. His wife, Rachel, had passed away from illness when Emily was barely 3 years old. And in the years since, Jake had carried 2 jobs at once without complaint, stitching together enough hours between the diner and weekend shifts at a hardware store to cover rent, groceries, and the growing pile of school supplies a 9-year-old always seemed to need, no matter how carefully he budgeted. He never let Emily see him tired. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. He hid the exhaustion behind small rituals instead, the same ones every night. Pancakes on Sunday mornings, even when he had worked a double the night before, a made-up bedtime story. Whenever the library books ran out, a 5-minute dance in the kitchen to whatever song happened to be playing on the radio just to hear her laugh. And every night, no matter how long his shift had been, he sat on the edge of her bed and reminded her of the one rule that mattered more than any other in their house, the rule his own father had once told him, and the one he intended to pass down exactly the same way. You can be poor, he told her, tucking the blanket beneath her chin, but you should never lose your honesty. Emily, who was smart in the quiet, observant way some children are, had started repeating it back to him lately, usually right before she fell asleep, as if she were the one reminding him instead of the other way around. His weekend hours at the hardware store were where most people never saw the version of Jake that lived outside the diner apron, restocking shelves before dawn and helping elderly customers carry bags of soil or lumber out to their cars, always refusing the extra $1 or $2 they tried to press into his hand out of gratitude. Always telling them the same thing with a small shake of his head, that helping was just part of the job. He kept a small photo of Rachel tucked into his wallet, faded slightly at the corners from years of handling. And on the hardest nights, the ones where the bills stacked a little too high, or Emily asked a question about her mother, he didn't quite know how to answer. He would take it out and look at it for a moment before folding it carefully back away, drawing whatever quiet strength he needed from it and moving on with his evening as though nothing had happened at all. The diner where Jake worked was a modest place on a busy corner, the kind with cracked vinyl booths, a bell above the door that rang every time someone walked in, and a laminated menu that hadn't changed its design in over a decade, but it stayed busy because the food was good, the coffee was strong, and the regulars trusted the staff who worked the floor. Jake was one of the reasons they kept coming back. He remembered names, remembered how people liked their coffee, remembered which table needed extra napkins before anyone even asked, and remembered which elderly customer always sat facing the window because the glare from the overhead lights bothered his eyes. His co-workers adored him, the way people adore someone who never makes them feel small. He covered shifts when someone's kid got sick, without ever making a show of the favor. He split his own tips quietly with the new dishwasher during a slow week, without mentioning it to anyone else, sliding a folded bill across the prep counter like it was nothing at all. There was only one person in that building who seemed to see Jake's kindness not as something to admire, but as something soft to be taken advantage of, and her name was Clara Adams. Clara had been the shift manager for almost 2 years, and in that time, a quiet unease had settled over the staff whenever she walked the floor, her heels clicking against the tile in a rhythm everyone had learned to listen for. Some of the newer servers had already learned to speak carefully around her, choosing their words the way you might choose your footing on thin ice, and more than once, a coworker had leaned close to Jake during a break in the walk-in cooler and whispered the same warning that had been passed along the kitchen line for months, always in a hush, always glancing over one shoulder first. Clara liked to hold on to tips that weren't hers, they said, and so far, nobody had been brave enough to say it out loud where it actually mattered. Jake had heard the whispers plenty of times before, filed away the way you file away a rumor you can't quite prove, but he had never seen it happen with his own eyes, not until the night everything changed. Clara Adams was 35 years old, sharp-featured, always dressed a shade too formally for a diner uniform, favoring blazers that seemed borrowed from a much more expensive job, and she carried herself like someone who believed authority was something you performed loudly, rather than something you earned quietly. She called herself a stickler for procedure, but the procedures she enforced seemed to shift depending entirely on her mood that day. She scheduled extra shifts without asking anyone's availability first, then penalized whoever couldn't make the impossible hours work around their other lives. She invented fines for infractions nobody could find written down anywhere in the handbook, deducting them straight from paychecks before an employee even had the chance to notice the missing dollars until it was too late to dispute. She had no patience for questions, and she had even less patience for pushback, especially in front of customers, where a single raised eyebrow from her could silence an entire dining room in seconds and send servers scurrying back to their stations without a word. Her favorite phrase, the one every employee at that diner could recite in their sleep by now, word for word, was simple and cold. "If you want to keep your job here," she would say, arms folded, chin tilted slightly upward, "then you listen to me." Nobody tested that sentence, not directly, not out loud. It wasn't respect that kept them quiet. It was fear, plain and practical, the kind that comes from watching what happens to the people who dare to push back. And in a town where good jobs weren't easy to find, fear was often enough to keep an entire staff walking on eggshells for 2 years straight. There were dozens of small stories the staff traded quietly among themselves whenever Clara was safely out of earshot, each one adding another brick to the wall of resentment nobody dared to tear down out loud. There was the time she docked an entire evening's pay from a teenage busser because a stack of plates had been left slightly crooked on the rack, calling it a safety violation even though nothing had ever broken. There was the morning she scheduled a young mother for a shift, directly overlapping her daughter's pediatrician appointment, refusing to swap it despite 2 other servers offering to cover, only relenting after the woman broke down crying in the walk-in cooler, where she thought no one could hear her. There was the afternoon she screamed at the line cook in front of a table of customers because an order had come out 2 minutes late, though everyone in the kitchen knew the delay had been caused by her own late produce order that morning. Each incident on its own might have been forgivable. The ordinary friction of a stressful job. Stacked together, they formed a pattern that everyone recognized, and no one, until now, had found the courage to challenge. On the night, everything changed. An elderly man walked into the diner alone, somewhere around 75 years old, moving slowly with a cane in one hand and a folded newspaper tucked under his arm. The bell above the door, announcing his arrival to a dining room that barely looked up. Jake seated him at his usual section without a second thought. The way he seated every customer, sliding a menu across the table and offering a warm greeting that cost nothing but seemed to mean something anyway. But something about the old man's quiet, tired eyes made Jake slow down and pay closer attention than usual that evening. The kind of attention that comes naturally to people who have learned, through their own hardship, to notice when someone else is carrying something heavy. He helped him settle his coat over the back of the booth so it wouldn't slide onto the floor. He offered to swap his order when the kitchen ran low on the fish special that night, walking him gently through 2 other options instead of simply apologizing and moving on to the next table. He refilled his coffee without being asked twice, and he lingered for a few extra minutes of conversation between other orders, asking about the newspaper folded on the table, asking how his evening was going, treating the man not as a table number scribbled on a ticket, but as a person who mattered enough to be seen. At one point, the old man mentioned quietly that he had once eaten at this very diner decades earlier with his late wife, back when the booths were a different color and the prices were a fraction of what they were now, and Jake, instead of rushing off to the next table, pulled up a spare chair for just a moment and let him finish the memory, nodding along as though he had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that costs a busy server nothing but a minute or two. But the old man's eyes had softened in a way that suggested it meant considerably more to him than that. When it came time to pay, The old man waited until Clara had walked toward the kitchen and the dining room had gone relatively quiet before he slipped something folded into Jake's palm, closing his weathered fingers gently over Jake's hand for just a moment. "Here's a little something to say thank you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, and when Jake unfolded it behind the counter a moment later, out of sight of the front register, he found $14 in worn, mismatched bills, some crumpled, one nearly torn along the fold. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't the kind of tip that would change anyone's life in the way people sometimes imagine when they picture a windfall arriving out of nowhere. But to Jake, standing there counting it twice just to be sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him, it was exactly enough to buy Emily a proper dinner that week, maybe even the ice cream she'd been asking about since her friend's birthday party, and for a few seconds, he let himself feel something close to relief settle in his chest. That relief didn't last long. Clara had seen the exchange from across the room, her eyes narrowing the way they always did when she sensed money changing hands that wasn't already accounted for in her ledger, and before Jake could even tuck the money into his apron pocket, she was crossing the floor toward him with her hand already extended, palm up, fingers impatient. "Hand it over," she said. No greeting, no explanation, just the flat demand hanging in the air between them, like something dropped from a great height. Jake blinked, genuinely confused for a moment, and asked what exactly she meant. "Company policy," she told him, her voice clipped and rehearsed. "Tips over a certain amount get pooled and redistributed at the end of the shift. And she needed that $14 right now, no further discussion required." Jake, calm but unwilling to simply comply without understanding why, asked her to show him where that policy was written down. Somewhere, anywhere, in the employee handbook they had all been given on their first day. Clara hesitated, just long enough for the hesitation itself to say everything that needed to be said, and then repeated herself louder, as if raising her volume could somehow substitute for the proof she didn't have. Jake held his ground, keeping his own voice level, even as hers climbed. "Tips belong to the person the customer chooses to give them to," he said quietly. And that was true both by common sense and, as it happened, by law, something Clara surely knew, even if she never said it out loud. But knowing she was wrong had never once stopped Clara from insisting she was right. Especially not in front of an audience. And the tension between them started pulling the attention of nearby customers, who slowly stopped talking to their own tables and turned to watch the scene unfolding at the counter instead, forks paused halfway to their mouths. Clara tried a different approach when the first one failed to move him, softening her tone just slightly and framing it instead as a favor between colleagues, telling him that everyone else on the team pooled their larger tips, and it would look bad, professionally, if he didn't do the same. Jake, unmoved by the change in tactic, simply asked her again to show him the written policy, and when she reached for her phone as though searching for it, then set it back down without finding anything, the pretense collapsed entirely, leaving only her raw insistence standing in its place. What happened next took less than a minute, though it would replay in Jake's mind for the rest of the night, and probably for a good while after that. Clara's face went red. Her voice climbed past the point of reason and control. And in front of the cooks leaning through the kitchen pass window, the other servers frozen mid-step with trays in their hands, and half a dozen customers still seated with their meals cooling in front of them, she screamed the words that ended his job on the spot. "You're fired," she shouted. "Right now, get out." There was no warning conversation, no private meeting in the back office. No attempt to lower her voice out of respect for the customers watching every second of it unfold. It happened in the open, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, in front of everyone Jake had worked beside for 6 long years. Jake didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice to match hers. And he didn't beg to keep the job he desperately needed to make rent that month. Instead, he stood a little straighter, looked around slowly at the silent dining room, at the faces of coworkers who looked more stunned than he felt, and said the only thing that felt true to him in that moment. "If keeping this job means trading away my honesty," he said, "then I accept losing it." Nobody in that diner spoke for several long seconds afterward. The only sound, the low hum of the refrigerator case behind the counter, and the distant clatter of a pan in the kitchen. Jake reached up, unclipped his name tag from his shirt, and set it gently on the counter beside the register, the small piece of plastic that had identified him for 6 years, now sitting there like something already belonging to somebody else's story entirely. He gathered his jacket from the back, said a quiet goodbye to the cooks who looked too stunned to respond with anything more than a nod, and pulled out his phone to send Emily a short message before he even reached the door. "Coming home early tonight, sweetheart." Then he walked toward the exit, $14 lighter in his pocket, having handed it over rather than fight further in front of a room full of strangers, but not 1 cent poorer in the thing that actually mattered to him most. Walking out into the cool night air, Jake felt the strange, hollow calm that sometimes follows a loss too large to fully process all at once. He thought about the rent due at the end of the month, about the hardware store hours that alone would never quite cover it, and about Emily waiting at home with her homework spread across the kitchen table, probably wondering why her father was coming home earlier than usual on a night he was supposed to be working late. He thought, too, about the $14, and how strange it was that a sum so small could end up costing him so much, and yet somehow still feel like the only decision he could have possibly made. By the time he reached the bus stop, he had already decided not to tell Emily the full story that night. Not the ugly parts anyway. Only that he had left his job, and that everything would be fine, because that was the kind of promise a good father learns to make sound true, even when he isn't entirely certain of it himself. Behind him, Clara straightened her blazer, smoothed her hair, and allowed herself the smallest, most satisfied smile, the kind of smile that comes from believing you have just won something important, unaware that the real cost of that moment had barely even begun to arrive. A few of the other servers exchanged glances across the dining room, quiet and unreadable, the kind of look shared between people who all wanted to say something, and none of whom felt safe enough to be the first. One of the cooks, an older man named Marcus who had worked beside Jake for most of those 6 years, set down his spatula for a moment and simply shook his head, low enough that only the person beside him could hear it, before turning back to the grill because the tickets were still coming, and the shift, however wrong it suddenly felt, was far from over. Just as Jake reached the front door, a sleek, dark car pulled up outside and stopped directly in front of the entrance, its engine humming low and expensive against the quiet street, and a man stepped out dressed far more simply than the vehicle suggested he could afford to be, a plain gray jacket, no tie, the kind of unremarkable clothing that let a person move through a room unnoticed. His name was William Harrison, 60 years old, with the kind of quiet, unassuming presence that made people underestimate him until it was already too late to matter. Nobody inside that diner recognized his face, and that was precisely how he preferred it, having learned decades earlier that people behave very differently when they think no one important is watching. He walked in through the same door Jake was walking out of, gave him a brief, polite nod as their shoulders nearly brushed in the doorway, and stepped up to the counter, where Clara was still catching her breath from the confrontation, her chest rising and falling slightly beneath her blazer. "Where's the manager?" he asked, his voice calm and unhurried, betraying nothing of what he already knew. Clara, sensing an opportunity to impress someone who looked important, straightened her posture instantly, smoothed a stray hair back into place, and introduced herself with practiced charm, offering him the best table in the house and a complimentary coffee to start. What she didn't know, what nobody in that building knew yet, was that William Harrison had finalized the purchase of the entire diner earlier that same morning, signing the last of the paperwork in a lawyer's office 3 blocks away, and he had walked in tonight not as a curious stranger looking for a quiet meal, but as the new owner conducting his very first, very quiet inspection of the place he now owned. "Don't tell anyone yet," he said simply, his tone giving away nothing. Clara, still convinced she was speaking to nothing more than a well-dressed regular passing through, agreed without asking why, already imagining the tip she might earn from such a polished-looking customer. William Harrison had built his career the slow, unglamorous way, buying small, struggling businesses across the region and turning them profitable again, not through cutting corners but through the opposite instinct entirely, a stubborn insistence that treating people fairly was, in the long run, simply good business. He had heard about this particular diner through a broker months earlier, drawn by the loyal customer base and the good bones of the building, and he had walked through it twice during the sale process without ever once mentioning who he was, preferring, as always, to see a place the way its own employees experienced it before he ever put his name on the deed. What he had witnessed, in his first 5 minutes back at the counter that night, a man being screamed at and stripped of his job over 14 honestly earned dollars, was not the kind of welcome he had expected, and it settled into him with a quiet, deliberate weight that would shape everything he did over the following days. Over the following 2 days, William Harrison did not announce himself, did not call a staff meeting, and did not so much as raise an eyebrow when he walked past employees who had no idea their new boss was standing 3 feet away from them at the coffee station or lingering near the register. Instead, he asked quietly, through the diner's outgoing general manager who had stayed on briefly during the transition, for access to the security footage, the financial records, the tip logs going back several months, and any customer complaints that had ever been filed and quietly ignored. He sat alone in the small back office, late into the evening, long after the last customer had gone home, scrolling through hours of grainy camera footage with the same patient focus he had used decades earlier, building the small business empire that eventually allowed him to buy struggling little diners like this one, and turn them around, one honest decision at a time. What he found didn't surprise him nearly as much as it disturbed him. The footage showed Clara pocketing cash tips on multiple occasions, not once, not as some isolated lapse in judgment during a stressful shift, but repeatedly, over weeks and months, always when she believed no one important was watching, her movements practiced and quick, a habit worn smooth through repetition. In one clip from several weeks earlier, William watched Clara hand a nervous young server a piece of paper to sign in the back hallway near the walk-in cooler, something that looked, on closer inspection of the records afterward, suspiciously like a fabricated acknowledgement form, claiming the employee had voluntarily agreed to a tip-pooling policy that didn't officially exist anywhere in the company handbook. He had been given a copy of that morning. William paused the footage there for a long moment, rewound it, and watched it again before continuing his review, jotting a note in the small notebook he kept beside the keyboard. He didn't stop with the cameras alone. Over the next day, he quietly pulled aside the head cook during a lull in the kitchen, the cashier who worked the morning shift while restocking the register drawer, and, after a bit of careful searching through old receipts and a phone number scrawled in a reservation book, even managed to track down the elderly customer who had left Jake that $14 tip in the first place, calling him from a quiet corner of the parking lot. Each conversation followed the same pattern, told in slightly different words but never once contradicting the others. Each person, independently and without knowing what the others had said, described the same version of events. Jake Carter was reliable, kind, scrupulously honest, the kind of employee who stayed late without being asked, and never once cut a corner, even when no one was watching. Clara Adams, on the other hand, had a long and quiet history of behavior that none of them had felt safe reporting until someone finally, gently, asked the right question at the right time. The elderly customer, once he understood who was calling and why, spoke for nearly 10 minutes without needing much prompting at all, describing not just the evening of the $14 tip, but several earlier visits where Jake had gone quietly out of his way for him, adjusting his order without complaint, walking him slowly to his car once during a rainstorm, refusing a tip on that particular occasion because, as he had put it at the time, some things a person just does. William listened to every word, and by the time the call ended, he found himself less surprised by what Jake had done and more troubled by how long it had apparently taken for anyone in a position of authority to notice it. By the third day, William Harrison had seen enough to act. He called every employee to gather in the dining room before the doors opened for the morning shift, chairs pulled from booths and arranged in a loose half-circle facing a small screen he had set up on a rolling cart at the front of the room, and he offered no explanation for why, watching quietly as the staff filed in with sleepy, curious expressions, coffee cups still in hand. Clara stood near the back, arms folded, still unaware that the well-dressed man from 2 nights earlier was the same man who now owned her paycheck entirely. And she watched with mild curiosity as the first clip began to play across the small screen. Then her curiosity turned to confusion, her brow furrowing slightly, and her confusion turned, quickly, into something closer to panic, her hand tightening around her own elbow, as clip after clip rolled across the screen, showing her taking tips that were never hers to take, night after night, week after week. When the footage finally stopped and the screen went dark, William turned to face the room and asked one simple question, directed squarely at Clara, his voice still calm but carrying a weight it hadn't held 2 nights earlier at the register. "Is this what you'd call company policy?" he asked. Nobody answered. The silence in that dining room stretched long enough to become its own kind of verdict, broken only by the faint sound of the coffee machine finishing its cycle behind the counter. Marcus, standing near the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, finally exhaled slowly and muttered something under his breath that sounded a great deal like relief, while the young server, who had once been pressured into signing a false form, pressed a hand over her mouth, her eyes glassy, as though she could hardly believe someone had finally seen what she had spent months too afraid to say out loud. William reached into a folder he had been holding under one arm and placed the employee handbook on the counter, open to the exact page he had bookmarked the night before, the page that stated, in plain, unambiguous language, that gratuities belonged entirely to the employee the customer intended them for, no exceptions listed, no fine print to hide behind. Then, without raising his voice, without theatrics, without a single word wasted, he delivered the consequences one after another, each one landing with the quiet finality of a door closing. Clara was terminated. Effective immediately. Her file would be forwarded to the legal department for review, given the fabricated forms and the pattern of behavior the footage had made undeniable, and every dollar of tip money unaccounted for over the past several months would be audited, and wherever possible, returned to the employees it had been quietly stolen from over time. Clara's composure finally broke somewhere around the second sentence. She cried, wiping at her eyes with the back of one hand, and she pleaded for a second chance, reminding him how long she had worked there, how much she had sacrificed, as if tenure alone should be enough to erase everything the cameras had just shown an entire room full of people. William Harrison listened patiently until she had finished. And then he declined, calmly and without cruelty, but without hesitation either, before asking her quietly to gather her things. Clara walked out through the same front door Jake had walked out of days earlier, though this time no one softened the moment for her, and no expensive car waited outside to change the direction of her story the way one had for him. Afterward, William asked someone to call Jake and invite him back to the diner that same afternoon. Jake assumed, walking through the door with a slight knot of dread tightening in his stomach, that this was simply the final formality of an already finished chapter in his life. Perhaps paperwork to sign, or a last paycheck to collect, before he moved on to whatever came next. Instead, William Harrison stood up from behind the counter the moment Jake walked in, crossing the floor to meet him halfway, and extending his hand for a firm, genuine handshake that caught Jake completely off guard. "This restaurant doesn't need people who know how to obey the wrong orders," William told him, his eyes steady on Jake's, his grip firm. "It needs people who are brave enough to defend what's right, even when it costs them something in the moment." Jake, still catching up to what was happening, simply listened as William laid out what came next, ticking each point off with the same unhurried calm he used for everything. A raise, first, one that actually reflected 6 years of loyal, uncomplaining work. A promotion to shift supervisor, second, a title Jake had never once dared to hope for while working under Clara's shadow, and third, the authority to help train every new employee who walked through those doors from that point forward, to shape the culture of the place from the ground up, rather than simply survive within it. For a moment, Jake couldn't find any words at all, standing there in the same dining room where he had unclipped his name tag only days earlier. When he finally accepted, quietly, with his voice catching just slightly on the first syllable of yes, the rest of the staff, gathered nearby, and having heard every word through the pass window and the half-open kitchen door, broke into applause that Jake would remember clearly for the rest of his life. a sound warmer than anything he had expected to hear in that building again. Later that evening, once the dining room had emptied and the last dishes had been cleared, Jake sat alone for a few minutes in the small back office, the same office where Clara had once forced nervous employees to sign papers they didn't understand, and allowed himself, quietly and without an audience, to feel the full weight of what had happened over the last several days. He called Emily on his way home, not to tell her the news yet, saving that for her face in person, but simply to hear her voice ask about her homework and to promise her, truthfully this time, that everything really was going to be fine. 1 week later, on Jake's first official day wearing the title of shift supervisor, Emily walked into the diner after school wearing a new dress her father had bought her the day before, the pale blue one with small white flowers she had pointed out through a store window weeks earlier without ever expecting to actually own it, twirling once in the doorway, before spotting him behind the counter and breaking into a run across the tile. Jake knelt down and introduced her proudly to William, who happened to be walking through for one of his regular visits, checking in the way he now did with every location he owned, unannounced and unassuming as ever. "This is my daughter," he said, pride evident in every syllable. And Emily, tilting her head up at the new owner with the frank curiosity only a 9-year-old can manage, asked the question that had clearly been sitting on her mind all day. "Are you the one who made my dad the boss?" she asked. Jake laughed softly, embarrassed and delighted all at once. And William crouched down to her level, with a warm, unhurried smile that made him look, for a moment, far less like a businessman and far more like someone's favorite uncle. "Your father isn't just a good manager," he told her, choosing his words carefully, the way he chose most things. "Your dad is the most honest person I have ever hired." Emily wrapped her arms around her father's waist right there in the middle of the dining room, pressing her face into his apron, and more than a few of the staff nearby, wiping down tables or refilling napkin dispensers, had to look away for a moment, blinking a little too fast at the sight of it. In the weeks that followed, Jake didn't waste the opportunity he had been given. He built a transparent tipping policy that was posted clearly near the entrance for both staff and customers to see, printed in plain, simple language, so no one would ever again wonder where their gratuity actually went once it left their hand. He set up an anonymous suggestion box near the back office, a small wooden box with a slit cut into the top, so employees who were too nervous to speak up in person could still be heard without fear of the consequences that used to follow honesty in that building. He personally trained every new hire who came through the door, spending extra time on the one lesson he cared about more than any other, the same lesson he had spent years teaching his own daughter at the edge of her bed each night, the same lesson that had once cost him his job, and had, in the end, given him something far better in return. Marcus, the line cook who had once shaken his head quietly over a hot grill and said nothing, found himself smiling more often during those months, teasing Jake now and then about the new supervisor badge, though everyone could tell he meant every word of the pride behind the joke. Even the nervous young server, Clara, had once pressured into signing a fabricated form, found the courage, weeks later, to ask Jake a question in front of the whole team during training, something she never would have dared to voice under the old regime. And Jake answered it fully, patiently, without a trace of the impatience that had once been the only language spoken in that back office. Slowly, week by week, the culture of that little diner shifted, from a place people quietly dreaded working under, glancing over their shoulders and whispering warnings in the walk-in cooler, into a place people were genuinely proud to belong to, a place where a $14 tip would always, without question, end up exactly where it was meant to go. William Harrison visited less often as the months went on, satisfied that the place no longer needed his direct attention, though he never entirely stopped stopping by unannounced, still dressed as plainly as ever, still preferring to watch quietly from a corner booth, before anyone realized the owner was even in the building. On one such visit, he found Jake kneeling beside a nervous new hire near the coffee station, walking her patiently through exactly how the tipping policy worked and why it mattered so much to him personally, and William simply ordered his coffee, sat down, and let the moment continue undisturbed, feeling, for perhaps the first time in a long career of buying and fixing broken businesses, that this particular one no longer needed fixing at all. The diner's regulars noticed the change too. Even if they couldn't always name exactly what was different, only that the staff seemed to smile a little more easily now, that the servers lingered a little longer at the tables of elderly customers eating alone, and that whatever unspoken tension used to hang over the dining room had simply, quietly, lifted. On a quiet evening not long after, Jake and Emily stayed behind after closing to lock up the diner together, the way they had started doing every Friday since his promotion began, the dining room dim and peaceful behind them, chairs already turned up onto tabletops for the cleaning crew. Emily reached up and took her father's hand as he flipped the last light switch by the door, the dining room falling into soft shadow behind them, the neon sign outside still humming faintly against the darkening sky. "I knew it," she said simply, looking up at him with the kind of certainty only a child can carry so easily and so completely. "Good people always get what they deserve eventually." Jake smiled down at her, squeezing her small hand in his, and before they stepped outside into the cool evening air, his eyes drifted one last time to the small name tag pinned neatly on his chest, the letters catching the last bit of light from the diner sign above the door. Jake Carter, shift supervisor. Behind them, the restaurant stood quiet and steady, a fair and honest place once more. Proof, in its own small and unglamorous way, that doing the right thing, even when it costs everything in the moment, has a way of finding its way back around in the end, arriving not always when expected, but always, eventually, exactly when it is needed most. Years from now, when Emily is old enough to understand every part of the story her father never fully explained to her that first night, she will likely remember it not as a story about a stolen $14 or a manager who lost her temper in front of strangers, but simply as the night her father came home a little earlier than usual, sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and told her, without needing to raise his voice or prove a single point, that some things are worth losing everything for, as long as you never lose yourself along the way.